Hi, I'm Dana Goodnow, and welcome to a bird's eye view of Old Testament history. Have you ever found yourself in one of those situations where you just needed an additional ounce of courage, a boost to get you through, something that would help you overcome a difficult challenge? Maybe it was a project at work that was assigned to you and you knew it was above your normal level of ability, but you had to find the courage somehow to step forward and make that move. Or maybe you had to give a speech in public and that's not something you're comfortable with and you had to have extra courage. Where does that courage come from? Well, we find in the Old Testament a man who needed an extra dose of courage. His name was Joshua. And today we're going to look at the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. Joshua was the successor to Moses. He had big shoes, or if we could say it, sandals to fill, as he followed in the footsteps of Moses as the leader of the nation of Israel, taking the nation of Israel into the promised land. He needed courage to do that. And certainly God granted him that courage. And God was with him throughout. This is where we go when we need to find courage. In Joshua chapter 1, we read these words: "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, 'Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the great sea to the west, and no one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them.'" What a great promise. God says to Joshua, I am going to be with you. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. You can be courageous because I'm at your side. I've given you a big task to fulfill, following in the footsteps of Moses, leading the Israelites into the promised land. So this book of Joshua is one that's very encouraging to us as followers of Jesus Christ. It helps us to remember that our strength and courage come from the Lord. He helps us with those most difficult situations in life. We can trust him to help us. By way of background to the book of Joshua, we understand the author to be Joshua himself. He would have been the one to have penned these words, this record of Israel's history, probably around the year 1390 BC, at the end of his career as he is recording these facts. The theme that we could find is conquest, courage in the midst of conquest. What a great combination. The conquest of the promised land as the nation of Israel goes into the land of Canaan, defeats the enemy, and establishes itself as a nation. A key verse that we could identify is Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, where God says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." And that's a great promise for us as well, to know that God is with us wherever we go. And when we have Christ in our life, he is there to help us. By way of historical background, we understand that the story of Joshua follows on the heels of that account of Moses. After Moses' death, we come into the opportunity for the Israelites to finally cross into the promised land. And so this takes place after the death of Moses, just on the edge of the Jordan River, as the nation is ready to engage itself in conquest of Canaan. In this historical background, then, we understand that we are moving into the set of books that we could call the historical or political books, political in the sense that these books of the Old Testament describe the nation of Israel as a nation, as a political entity. The Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, set the foundation for what we find in this historical section of the Israelites as a nation in the promised land. By way of an outline for the book of Joshua, very simply, the book divides into two major sections. We'll find in the first 12 chapters a description of Israel inhabiting the promised land, that is, entering into the promised land, conquering the established tribes and nations that are in that land, God using the Israelites to eliminate them, judge them essentially for their sins, and to give the land to the Israelites. So this idea of inhabiting the land, which is going to involve them crossing the Jordan River and going into the battles that will secure the land for them. That's the first part of the book, chapters 1 through 12. Israel inhabits the promised land. The second part of the book, chapters 13 through 24, Israel inherits the promised land. That is, this section goes into detail about which tribe would have which territory within the promised land, their inheritance in this land of Canaan. And so we find details about that inheritance. The bulk of our study will be in the first part of the book, where we find the nation of Israel crossing into the promised land. Israel inhabits the promised land. Crossing the Jordan River was going to involve a great deal of effort on the part of the Israelites. It would require having a leader. The person to take the lead, of course, is Joshua. And this call of Joshua that we have just read a few moments ago, where God says to Joshua, I'm going to be with you. I will not leave you. I will never give up on you. I will be with you as you make this step forward. And so we have the leadership of Joshua following after Moses. As Joshua prepares the people to enter into the promised land in chapter 2 of Joshua's book, we read about 2 spies that Joshua sends into the promised land to begin to do a little bit of reconnaissance, to take a look particularly at a very heavy stronghold in Canaan, the city of Jericho. Jericho was a walled city. It was well protected. It was going to be a difficult city to conquer. And so Joshua sent in 2 spies to examine the land, to get a feel for what it would take to conquer this great city of Jericho. Well, while they are in the city of Jericho, their presence there is discovered by the leaders of that city. And so these 2 spies have to hide, and they are able to hide in the home of a woman by the name of Rahab. And Rahab protected these 2 spies, kept the city officials from finding them, gave instructions to the spies how to escape, and allowed them to escape out her wall side window off from a scarlet cord that she had, and they could climb down to safety and run into the hills and hide until the dust had settled a bit, and they could return to Joshua and the Israelites east of the Jordan River. Well, this is exactly what happened, and with the scarlet cord that we read about in chapter 2, Rahab helps rescue the spies. The spies make an arrangement with Rahab. When the Israelites come and destroy Jericho, Rahab's home would be protected. She was to leave that scarlet cord hung outside of the window along the wall, and those who were in her household would be protected. Interestingly, we find that Rahab becomes a woman of faith in the true and living God. We know that because in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, we discover that she herself becomes a part of the line that will lead to the coming of Christ, the Davidic line. So an interesting individual, to be sure, Rahab in the city of Jericho. Well, the spies return back to Joshua, give the report that they were sent to evaluate. And so Joshua prepares the nation of Israel to cross the Jordan River to go into the promised land. At long last, the time had come. And so in chapter 3, we find that it's necessary for the people, first of all, to consecrate themselves, that is, to prepare themselves in a spiritual way to be ready for that land. So in verse 5, chapter 3, Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Get ready, get your soul ready, get your heart ready to see what God is going to do. And so they set themselves apart for God. And in that same chapter, in verse 7, the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. So God would not only take care of the nation of Israel, but he would make sure that Joshua was well respected, that the people would recognize in Joshua the leader that they had intended for him to be. The nation of Israel, of course, obeys. They begin to make these steps forward as they prepare to cross the river. And in chapter 3, verse 14, we read, so when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. And the Jordan is at flood stage all during the harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. And so they had to take that step of faith. Those who were leading the nation of Israel, they had to actually put their foot near the water's edge. And as they began to make their way into the river, only then, it seems, did the river stop and the dry land appeared and they were able to cross over on dry land. Obedience is so important, even when it doesn't look like there's a possibility to make our way through. When we're obedient to God, he makes the way. So the Ark of the Covenant leads them. The nation of Israel is able to cross over the Jordan River on dry ground and very much imitating, if you will, the crossing through of the Red Sea. And the nation of Israel arrived safely on the western side of the river Jordan into the promised land because they were obedient. And in chapter 4, we find that through Joshua's instructions, the nation puts up a monument, stones that they brought out of the riverbed to assemble on the shore to remind them this is the place and this is the time when God delivered his people and brought them into the promised land and fulfilled his promise, a promise that goes back to Moses. Yes, even goes back to Abraham and that great covenant that God made with Abraham. So the Israelites are able to cross the Jordan River, able to be safely on the other side, at last in the land of Canaan. Once they've arrived, now they have inhabitants in Canaan that need to be driven out, that God is going to provide this land for them, and that's going to take military action to do this as they drive these tribes out of Canaan. Joshua was a great military leader, a great general, and he knew best how to expedite this change. And so we find that he did that which is often common in military circles, to divide and conquer. I think even parents do that with their children sometimes, don't they? Divide and conquer. This idea of dividing and conquering the nations within the land of Canaan was very important to Joshua. So he begins with a central campaign. As the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, they came in at the center point where Jericho was established. They begin that conquest at Jericho. And you'll remember the story of Jericho in chapter 6, where God instructs the Israelites not to engage so much in a military action, but to simply march around the city in silence once a day for 7 days, and the last day to march around 7 times, and then on the 7th time to shout and blow trumpets. And as soon as they did that, the walls came tumbling down. The walls of Jericho fell. The Israelites were able to go into this protected city, this walled city, and to take conquest, to take possession of that city, to conquer it. And they were very effective in doing that because God was with them. And God took care of them. And of course, Rahab was spared, and the Israelites were able to begin that conquest of the promised land by taking that most strategic city in the central part of the region. Their next city to attack was the city of Ai, and that city, they didn't have as good of a start with that one. They were actually defeated in their first attempt at taking the smaller city of Ai, partly because, and primarily because, there had been a sin in the camp. A man by the name of Achan who had taken some of the possessions from Jericho, the things that that were forbidden for people to take, the possessions that were to belong to the Lord. Well, Achan decided to take some garments and some precious metals and things for himself and hide them in his tent floor. Because of the sin, God had withdrawn his blessing on the Israelites. And so the Israelites lost in their first battle with Ai. They had to identify the situation, the cause of this, and God pointed out, this is why you lost. This is why you actually lost lives in that battle, because someone in the camp has disobeyed me. And so it became apparent that this was a sin that Achan had committed, and when that was dealt with, then God would again bless the nation of Israel, and in fact they were then able to go on and conquer the city of Ai and the rest of those central cities along the way. One of those central cities realized that they had no chance of winning against the Israelites and the Israelites' God, and so this city of Gibeon decided instead to make a treaty with the Israelites. And they came to the Israelites and said, we live a long, long way away from here. We'd like to make a treaty with you. And so they all agreed that they would have a treaty together. And so in chapter 9, we'll find in verse 14 that the men of Israel sampled the provisions that these representatives from Gibeon had brought, but they did not inquire of the Lord. This is a significant phrase. They didn't inquire of the Lord, and Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. Well, soon they discovered the Gibeonites weren't people who lived far, far away. They were the next door neighbors to the cities of Jericho and Ai. But now Israel had entered into a treaty with them, and God expected them to keep their word. And so the Israelites had to maintain a relationship with the Gibeonites. Well, other surrounding cities and tribes were upset with the Gibeonites for making this treaty, and so they attacked Gibeon. And Israel now was subject to helping them along the way. This began the southern campaign for the Israelites, the cities south of Jericho. And in the southern campaign, the Gibeonites were attacked. And so Israel came to their defense, came to help them as they had promised. And in doing so, they won a great victory over these tribes of the southern part of the Promised Land. And in this victory, the victory was so great that we find that Joshua cried out to God for more time to complete that conquest, to complete that victory. And in chapter 10, verse 12, it says, "On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, O sun, stand still over Gibeon, O moon, over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies." And so the sun stopped that day. It was a miracle, to be sure, and it was a way in which God extended the day in order for Joshua to complete the conquest in that region. And so the southern campaign was affected miraculously, and God was able to give the southern cities to Joshua as well. And then, having divided and conquered divided through the middle part of Canaan, through Jericho and Ai, now in the southern section, now it was time to go north. The northern tribes that lived in Canaan began to mobilize themselves and actually work together to try to defeat the Israelites, largely from the city of Hatzor in the north, a large and influential city. And so the people of Hatzor gathered others around, and they came and they were ready to attack the Israelites. Well, the Israelites beat them to the punch and attacked them instead in this northern coalition of kings, and they were able to effect a complete victory. In chapter 11, verse 12 of Joshua, we read, "Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded." When we read these phrases about the total destruction of a city or of a tribe of people, it does raise questions in our mind why God would allow such a defeat to happen. And we can only trust that God is good and right in all that he does and all that he commands. We would understand that these tribal groups living in the land of Canaan were extreme pagans. They were living in very blatant sin against God. They had been disobedient to God and his ways. And this seems to be a surgical strike, if you will, in a way in which God is eliminating sin and sinfulness from the land so that the Israelites can live there and grow in holiness, which of course became a challenge for them as well, and we'll see that in later books. But Joshua was able to conquer the land by God's help, of course, miraculously, first defeating the cities in the central section of Canaan, then in the south, and then in the north. And so chapter 12 of Joshua gives a recap of that conquest. So this is that first section of the book of Joshua. Israel inhabits the promised land. The second part of the book, Israel inherits the promised land. And here we find a record of the different tribal groups and where they settled, how the land was distributed to them, tribe by tribe. There were 2.5 tribes who took possession of land east of the Jordan, Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. And then we find the rest of the tribes being given land on the west side of the Jordan. And so these were allotted appropriately according to each tribe and its needs. We do find in chapter 18 an interesting reference where it talks about the tabernacle of the Lord. Remember that portable temple, if you will, where the people of Israel were to sense the very presence of God. And in chapter 18, verse 1, it says, "The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. And the country was brought under their control, but there were still other tribes to defeat." But the tabernacle was established at Shiloh, and there it would stay for much of the time leading down through the years until the times of the kings. And so God was present with his people. Finally, we come to the end of the book in chapters 23 and 24, where Joshua gives final charges to the people of Israel. Joshua now is aging out. His time has come for him to challenge the nation to be faithful to God. And in chapter 24, we have these very familiar words. Verse 14, "Now fear the Lord," Joshua says, "and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods of your forefathers that they worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord." Serve the Lord. "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you," he says, "then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your forefathers that they served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." And Joshua puts out this challenge to the Israelites. And of course, the Israelites rally and say, no, we too will serve the Lord. We'll serve only the God of the Bible. And so this was their commitment, at least initially. We know that each commitment that we make has its dangers and its risks because we often slide away from those commitments. This would be the case with the Israelites eventually. But at this moment in their history, they are fully committed to following the Lord. And God blesses them, gives them the promised land, and helps them to establish themselves in the land of Canaan. It will be in that land of Canaan, the land of promise, that we will find much of then Israel's history down until the captivity. What we learn from this book of Joshua, so many good lessons. First of all, if God is with us, we need not fear anything. When we need that extra dose of courage, we know that God is there with us and he'll help us through whatever is challenging us today. We know that God keeps all his promises. He promised to give them this land, and he always keeps his promises, no matter how difficult they may seem to us. It must have seemed like a daunting task to Joshua to march a nation into a land and conquer it. But God keeps his promises, and God works through faithful leaders to accomplish his purposes. Joshua was the right man for the right time to accomplish God's purpose. You and I might be the right person in our setting to accomplish God's purpose in sharing our faith, which may take courage, or being available to someone in need. This is what we learn from the book of Joshua.